The beach was supposed to be empty at this hour. Quiet, harmless, forgettable, but he froze the moment he saw her. Barefoot in the sand, wearing only the bottom of her bikini, her laughter carried by the wind, as her fingers were tightly intertwined with another man's hand. Not just any man, her boss. The same man who had shaken his hand weeks ago, smiled across dinner tables, and praised his wife's hard work. In that instant, the world tilted. He had trusted late nights, business trips, muted phone calls. He had believed love meant patience. Yet here she was, exposed in more ways than one, walking freely while he stood hidden, shattered, and invisible. What hurt most wasn't just the betrayal, it was the certainty that this wasn't a mistake. It was a secret life, and this moment was only the surface of something far darker. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment with your location and local time, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. He didn't move for a long time. After they disappeared down the shoreline, the sound of the waves kept rolling in, indifferent, steady, cruelly calm. It felt wrong that the world could continue so normally, while something inside him had just cracked open. He stood there, half hidden behind a row of palms, heart pounding so hard it made his ears ring, replaying the image again and again, as if his mind were trying to prove it wasn't real. Her posture haunted him, relaxed, familiar, intimate, in a way that didn't belong to a single stolen moment. She had leaned into that man without hesitation, her hand resting in his, like it had done so countless times before. That was what hurt most. Not the nakedness, not even the hand-holding. It was the ease. He finally turned away when he realized his legs were shaking. Each step back toward the parking lot felt heavier than the last, like the sand itself was trying to hold him there, forcing him to face what he wasn't ready to name yet. He sat in his car without starting the engine, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles burned. This wasn't how betrayal was supposed to happen. There should have been warning signs he could point to now, something obvious he could blame himself for missing, but all he had were fragments that suddenly rearranged themselves into something ugly and sharp. The late nights that had become routine, the way she had started showering immediately after coming home from team dinners, her phone always face down, the sudden insistence on privacy framed as independence. He had swallowed every explanation because love, he believed, meant giving someone room to breathe. He remembered defending her, to friends, to his own quiet doubts, telling himself she was ambitious, driven, different, telling himself he was proud of her. The engine finally turned over, the sound too loud in the empty lot. As he drove away from the beach, his hands stayed locked at 10 and 2, eyes fixed forward, as if looking anywhere else might cause him to break. He didn't follow them. Every instinct screamed to confront her, to demand answers, to shatter the illusion immediately. But another voice, quieter, steadier, held him back. Not yet. At home, the house greeted him with a familiar silence. Shoes by the door, a throw blanket folded neatly on the couch, their life, carefully arranged, still pretending to be intact. He stood in the entryway longer than necessary, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock on the wall, proof that time was still moving. Whether he wanted it to or not, he poured a glass of water and didn't drink it. His reflection in the kitchen window looked older than it had that morning. His jaw was tight, eyes hollowed by something that hadn't fully settled yet. Shock, maybe, or the beginning of grief. When he checked his phone, there was a message from her waiting. Just one line. Dinner ran late. I'll be home soon. Don't wait up. The words were gentle, casual, perfectly normal. His thumb hovered over the screen, the urge to reply burning in his chest. He imagined typing something simple. Okay. He imagined asking where she was. He imagined sending the photo he had secretly taken from a distance. Their hands intertwined, undeniable. Instead, he locked the phone and set it face down on the counter. He moved through the house like a stranger, noticing details he had ignored for years. The framed photos of vacations, their wedding portrait in the hallway, both of them laughing mid-motion. Caught in a moment that now felt staged, He stopped in front of it longer than he meant to, searching her frozen expression for any hint of who she really was back then. Had she already been capable of this? In the bedroom, he opened the closet without fully knowing why. Her side was immaculate, dresses arranged by color, shoes lined up with care. On the top shelf sat a small travel bag he didn't recognize. It wasn't new, but it wasn't old either. He pulled it down slowly, like it might explode if handled too quickly. Inside were sunscreen, a folded cover-up, and at the bottom, a hotel keycard. Not the hotel she had mentioned. His breath caught. The card wasn't just proof, it was confirmation. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a single bad decision made on impulse. It was planned, rehearsed, lived. He put everything back exactly as he found it, heart racing now with a different energy. Anger began to edge out the shock, sharp and focused, not explosive, controlled, the kind that demanded answers and refused to settle for half-truths. When the front door finally opened, he was sitting on the couch, hands folded, expression neutral enough to pass. She walked in, smiling, hair still damp, skin faintly sun-kissed. She looked beautiful in the way that used to make his chest ache with affection. Now it just made his stomach twist. "Hey," she said softly. Leaning down to kiss his cheek, he felt it like a brand. "Long day?" he asked, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. She sighed, rolling her shoulders. "You have no idea. These retreats are exhausting." Retreats. The word echoed in his head while she talked about meetings and deadlines, her voice smooth, confident. She moved around the kitchen as if nothing had changed, pouring herself a drink, kicking off her shoes. Every gesture felt rehearsed now, every word suspect. He watched her closely, noticing things he never would have questioned before. The way she avoided his eyes for just a fraction too long, the way she checked her phone and quickly locked it, the faint indentation on her wrist where someone else's fingers had been wrapped not hours ago. He nodded at the right moments, asked safe questions, played his role. That night, he lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling while she slept peacefully, her breathing slow and even. At some point, her hand drifted toward him, resting on his chest like it had 1,000 times before. He didn't move it away. He didn't hold it either. The unfairness of it all settled heavily in his chest. How easily she slept, how deeply he trusted, how quickly everything he thought he knew had unraveled without warning. By morning, the shock had hardened into resolve. He showered, dressed, and kissed her goodbye like any other day, told her to have a good meeting, watched her leave with a smile that felt like it belonged to someone else. The moment the door closed, he sat down at the table and opened his laptop. If she had a secret life, he was done being the last one to know. He started with the basics, shared calendars, bank statements, travel receipts. Nothing illegal, nothing reckless, just observation, just truth. Each new detail tightened the knot in his stomach, but also sharpened his focus. Patterns emerged quickly once he knew where to look. This wasn't about jealousy anymore. It was about reality. And somewhere between the first uncovered lie and the last untouched truth, he understood something clearly for the first time since the beach. This story wasn't going to end quietly. Not this time. By the third night, sleep had become something distant and unreliable. He lay beside her, eyes open in the dark, listening to the faint sounds of the house settling, memorizing the rhythm of her breathing, as if it were evidence too. Every small noise startled him now. Every vibration of her phone felt like a threat. During the day, he functioned on instinct. He went to work. He answered emails. He smiled when required. But beneath it all, his mind was busy assembling a quiet timeline, stitching moments together into something that finally made sense. He remembered the first time her schedule had changed, how she'd come home glowing, energized, talking about mentorship and visibility. How proud he'd been, telling her she deserved recognition after years of being overlooked. He had encouraged her to lean in, to take risks. He wondered now if that encouragement had opened a door he hadn't known how to close. Late one afternoon, he sat alone in a coffee shop near his office, laptop open but untouched. Instead, he watched reflections in the window, people passing, laughing, living uncomplicated lives. He opened his shared cloud storage and scrolled slowly, deliberately. Most of it was mundane: grocery lists, old photos, work files. Then, buried in a folder, labeled with a neutral name, he found images that stopped his breath. Not explicit, not obscene, but intimate in a way that left no room for doubt. Photos of sunsets taken from hotel balconies, 2 glasses of wine on a small round table, a man's hand entering the frame, always the same watch visible on his wrist. The timestamps lined up perfectly with her retreats. The places matched the credit card charges he'd already noticed. He closed the laptop gently, as if the truth were fragile and might shatter if handled too roughly. His chest ached, but not in the wild, panicked way it had at the beach. This pain was heavier, more deliberate, the kind that settles into your bones. That night, she came home later than usual. He was in the kitchen, pretending to read. When she walked in, her eyes flicked to him, assessing, calculating. For a moment, something unreadable passed over her face. "You're quiet lately," she said carefully. "Just tired," he replied. "A lot on my mind." She nodded, accepting the answer too easily. That should have comforted him once. Now, it felt like another lie allowed to breathe. As she showered, he sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. The injustice of it all pressed down on him. He had been faithful without effort, loyal without negotiation, while she had been building a second life right under his nose. Supported by his trust, when she joined him, she wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his back. The gesture was tender, practiced. "You know I appreciate you, right?" she murmured, "for always being there." He closed his eyes. That night, when she finally fell asleep, he carefully lifted her phone from the nightstand. His hands were steady now, calm. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He already knew what he would find. There were messages he couldn't access, protected, hidden behind apps he didn't recognize. But there were others she hadn't bothered to erase. Short exchanges that spoke volumes through what they didn't say. Inside jokes, hotel confirmations forwarded casually, a message from an unsaved number that read, "Same place as last time. You looked incredible today." He put the phone back exactly where it had been. The next day, he reached out to someone he hadn't spoken to in months, a friend who worked in compliance, someone who understood systems, paper trails, consequences. He didn't explain everything at first, just enough to ask for advice, hypothetical questions framed carefully. The response was immediate and serious. "Don't confront yet," the message read. "If there's power imbalance involved, this can get ugly fast. Protect yourself first." Power imbalance. The words echoed in his mind all evening. He started to look at her differently then, not just as someone who had betrayed him, but as someone entangled in something potentially darker. Her anxiety made more sense. The way she flinched when her phone rang, the sudden mood swings. The guilt sharpened into something more complex, more dangerous. Still, sympathy didn't erase choice. A few days later, he tested a theory. Casually, over dinner, he mentioned an upcoming company event he knew she wouldn't actually attend. He watched her closely as she responded. Her face tightened for half a second before she smiled and said she'd see what she could do. That night, he checked the calendar. A hotel booking appeared within the hour. The confirmation settled it. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about manipulation, about leverage, about a man who had inserted himself into their marriage and treated it like collateral damage. He began documenting everything: screenshots, dates, times, conversations. He saved copies in multiple places, naming folders with bland titles that wouldn't draw attention. Each action grounded him further, pulling him out of emotional freefall and into something steadier: control. One evening, as he was organizing files, he found something unexpected. A document partially downloaded, never opened, a legal-looking form with her name on it. The file was corrupted, but the title was clear enough to chill him. Non-disclosure agreement. His pulse quickened. He didn't know the details yet, but he knew enough to understand the implication. Silence had been purchased, or demanded. The realization hit him harder than the beach ever had. She wasn't just risking their marriage. She was trapped in something designed to keep her quiet. That night, when she came home, she seemed fragile, tired in a way that went beyond work. She ate little, drank too much, and eventually sat beside him on the couch, pulling her knees up to her chest. "Do you ever feel like your life is slipping out of your hands?" she asked suddenly. He looked at her, really looked at her, and felt the sharp collision of anger and sorrow. This was the moment, he realized, when he could still choose comfort over truth. He could lie to protect the illusion just a little longer. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "but I think it matters what you do when you notice it." She nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't touch her. Later, alone again, he stared at the evidence spread across his screen and understood something fundamental. This wasn't a story about catching someone in the act. It was about uncovering a system of betrayal that thrived on silence, and he was done being silent. What he didn't know yet, what made his stomach tighten, even as resolve hardened, was how far the consequences would ripple once the truth finally surfaced. Some secrets don't collapse quietly. They explode. By the end of the week, he had learned how to live two lives at once. There was the visible one: routine, polite conversations, shared meals eaten while the television murmured in the background. And then there was the hidden one, unfolding quietly behind his eyes, where every word she spoke was weighed, every movement catalogued. He began to notice how carefully she curated her version of the truth. Stories repeated with minor variations, names swapped, times shifted just enough to blur certainty. It wasn't sloppy lying. It was practiced, which meant it hadn't started recently. That realization cut deeper than anything else. One evening, while she was out for yet another team dinner, he opened the drawer where they kept old documents, tax records, warranties, insurance policies. He wasn't looking for anything specific anymore. He'd learned that the truth often revealed itself when you stopped forcing it. That was when he found the updated policy. It was subtle. A revised beneficiary line, dated just 3 months earlier. Her name was still there. His was not. The change had been filed quietly, without discussion, without a single word to him. For a long moment, he simply stared at the page. His reflection in the glossy surface looked like a stranger eye's dark expression hollowed out by disbelief. 3 months. That meant decisions had been made, calculations weighed, futures imagined without him in them. The unfairness of it settled into his chest like a weight. He had been planning anniversaries, weekend trips, talking about maybe buying a bigger place someday, while she had been preparing an exit with surgical precision. When she came home that night, she was humming softly, keys dangling from her fingers. She stopped when she saw him standing by the table, the document laid out neatly in front of him. "What's that?" she asked, too quickly. "Something I didn't recognize," he replied calmly. Her eyes flicked down, and the color drained from her face. For a moment, the silence between them felt alive, charged with everything they hadn't said yet. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, sat down slowly, like her legs had lost their strength. "I was going to tell you," she said finally. He nodded once. "When?" She looked away. "I don't know. Things got complicated." "Complicated?" The word echoed like an insult. "Is that what you call it?" he asked. His voice, still measured, still controlled. He was proud of that. "Or is there another word you've been using?" Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. He recognized that too, the performance of emotion, held back just enough to remain useful. "He has power," she whispered. "You don't understand." I understand you made choices, he said quietly. Over and over, her shoulders sagged. It wasn't like that at first. He believed her. And that, somehow, hurt even more. She told him pieces then. Not the whole story. He could feel the gaps, but enough to sketch the outline. A promotion dangled, pressure disguised as praise. A relationship that blurred lines slowly, then all at once. Fear of losing everything she had worked for. Fear of being exposed. Fear of being believed. He said, "No one would take my side," she said, voice breaking. "That I'd be the one blamed." He listened, without interrupting, hands clasped tightly together. Every instinct screamed at him to either comfort her or walk away. Instead, he did neither. "Did you ever plan to stop?" he asked. She hesitated. That was answer enough. When she finally went to bed, exhausted and hollow-eyed, he stayed up alone, the house feeling colder than it ever had. He replayed her words again and again, searching for sincerity, for accountability. He found fear, he found regret. What he didn't find was responsibility. The next morning, he contacted the compliance friend again. This time, he didn't frame it hypothetically. There was a long pause before the response came. "If you have evidence," the message read, "this is bigger than an affair, and if you don't act carefully, you could become collateral damage." Collateral damage. He felt something steady click into place inside him. Over the next few days, things escalated quietly. She became more attentive, more affectionate, as if sensing the ground shifting beneath her. She cooked his favorite meals, suggested counseling, spoke about resetting and starting over. He didn't reject any of it outright. He also didn't commit. Meanwhile, new pieces fell into his hands. An email forwarded accidentally, a calendar invite that wasn't deleted in time, a voicemail meant for someone else, left in haste. Each one tightened the net. Then came the message that changed everything. It arrived late at night from an unknown number. "You don't know me," it read. "But I was where your wife is now, and it doesn't end the way you think." They met in a quiet cafe across town 2 days later. The woman sat across from him, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. She looked tired, older than her years, like someone who had survived something she didn't fully understand yet. She spoke carefully, choosing her words like stepping stones. She described patterns, control masked as mentorship, rewards paired with threats, silence enforced through paperwork and shame. "You think it's about desire," she said softly. "It's about power." He left the cafe with his mind racing and his resolve sharpened into something unbreakable. The final confirmation came when he accessed a folder he hadn't noticed before, hidden deep within shared storage. Inside were scanned documents, contracts, agreements, names he didn't recognize until he did. There were more women. The betrayal expanded outward, no longer contained within the boundaries of his marriage. It was systemic, calculated, protected. That night, as he lay awake beside her once more, he felt something unexpected settle over him. Clarity. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to explode. And he wasn't going to disappear quietly. Somewhere, not far from now, there would be consequences. Not born of revenge, but of truth brought into the open, where it could no longer be twisted or denied. She stirred in her sleep, murmuring his name softly. As if reaching for safety, he stared into the dark and understood something painful and freeing all at once. Loving her had cost him his innocence, but choosing himself would cost her the lies. And the story was only beginning. The days that followed moved with a strange, suspended quality, like time itself was holding its breath. Outwardly, nothing dramatic happened. There were no slammed doors, no screaming matches, no tearful confessions in the middle of the night. Instead, there was a careful choreography of normalcy, each of them playing a role they no longer fully believed in. He woke early every morning now, before the alarm, before she stirred. In those quiet hours, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop. The soft glow of the screen, illuminating a face that no longer looked uncertain. He reviewed documents, timelines, cross-checked details. What had once felt overwhelming was now methodical, cold, even. Patterns were everywhere once he allowed himself to see them. Expense reports aligned too neatly with hotel bookings, client meetings that always happened off-site, always overnight, corporate emails written in neutral language that hinted at private arrangements just beneath the surface, and always the same name looping back into everything, like a signature pressed invisibly into each lie. She sensed the shift in him, even if she couldn't name it. Her questions became cautious. Her touch lingered longer, as if trying to anchor him. Sometimes she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking, her expression tight with something like fear. One evening, she tried again. "I've been thinking," she said softly, setting 2 cups of tea on the table between them. "Maybe we should take a break, go somewhere, just us." He looked at the steam curling upward, at the hands that trembled just slightly as she pushed the cup toward him. "A break from what?" he asked. She swallowed. "From all this, from stress, from work." He met her eyes then, really met them. And for a brief moment, he saw something raw there. Regret, perhaps, or the terror of someone who senses the walls closing in. "I don't think distance fixes something built on secrets," he said. She flinched, just enough to confirm she knew exactly what he meant. That night, after she went to bed, he made a decision that felt heavier than any other so far. He reached out to the woman from the cafe again, asking if she would be willing to speak to someone else. Someone who could make what they knew impossible to ignore. The reply came quickly. "I've been waiting for someone to ask," she wrote. Over the next week, his quiet preparation accelerated. He consulted professionals without announcing it, asked precise questions, learned the difference between rumor and admissible proof. He wasn't interested in spectacle. He wanted accountability. At the same time, the pressure on her visibly increased. Phone calls taken in other rooms, messages deleted seconds after arriving. A constant tension in her shoulders, like she was bracing for impact. Once, late at night, he heard her crying softly in the bathroom, the sound muffled by running water. For a moment, instinct urged him to go to her, to offer comfort, to blur the lines again. He stayed where he was. Compassion didn't require self-destruction. The turning point came unexpectedly. On an ordinary Thursday afternoon, he was at work when his phone buzzed with a notification from a shared account he'd forgotten they still had access to. A document had been uploaded, then hastily removed, but not quickly enough. He opened it. It was a draft email, unsent, addressed to a legal firm. The subject line referenced potential exposure and containment strategy. Her name appeared alongside several others. At the bottom, the man's name was signed with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The language was chillingly clinical. Damage assessment, risk mitigation, narrative control. No remorse, no humanity, just strategy. His hands trembled as he read, not from fear, but from the weight of confirmation. This was never about love. It was about control, about using people as buffers against consequence. He forwarded the document to a secure folder, backed it up twice, and closed his phone. That evening, when she came home, she seemed different, lighter, almost, as if she believed something had been handled. "Good day?" he asked casually. She smiled, too quickly. "Yeah, productive," he nodded, filing the response away. Later, as they sat across from each other eating dinner, she spoke again, her voice tentative. "If something came out," she said, not meeting his eyes, "about my job, would you believe me?" The question landed between them like a fragile object, easily broken. "I'd believe evidence," he replied. "And I'd believe patterns." Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "And me." He held her gaze steadily. "I believe you've been scared. I also believe you knew better." Tears spilled then, uncontrolled this time. She covered her face, shoulders shaking. The sight twisted something in his chest. But it didn't undo his resolve. "I didn't know how to get out," she whispered. "You could have told me," he said, "at any point." Silence stretched between them, thick with everything that could no longer be unsaid. A few days later, the first external tremor hit. A quiet internal inquiry was announced at her company. Framed as routine, temporary, nothing to worry about, according to the carefully worded email sent to all staff. But he saw how her hands shook when she read it, how she sank onto the couch as if her legs had given out. "They said it's nothing," she insisted, panic bleeding through the words. "Just a formality." He didn't contradict her. Instead, he asked, "Did they mention his name?" She hesitated. That was enough. The inquiry moved quickly once it began, too quickly to be coincidental. Witnesses were contacted, documents requested, calendars audited. The machinery of accountability, once activated, proved impossible to slow. He stayed in the background, watching, waiting. He knew his role now, not the betrayed husband seeking vengeance, but the man who refused to let the truth be buried. One night, she finally broke. "They're going to destroy me," she sobbed, curled on the bed, clutching his arm. "He said he'd protect me. He promised." He gently removed her hand. "He can't protect you from reality," he said quietly, "and neither can I." The words were not cruel. They were honest. In the days that followed, headlines didn't explode. Names weren't splashed across screens. That came later. First came the quiet unraveling. Resignations, leaves of absence, carefully crafted statements that satisfied no one. He watched her pack a bag one morning, her movements mechanical, eyes hollow. "I'm staying with a friend," she said. "Just for a bit." He nodded. As the door closed behind her, the house felt impossibly still, empty, yet lighter. For the first time in weeks, he sat down and breathed without feeling like his chest might collapse. He didn't know exactly how this would end. He only knew it wouldn't end with him pretending anymore. Somewhere, beyond the walls of their shared life, consequences were taking shape. And once set in motion, they wouldn't stop. Not now, not ever. The house changed after she left. Not dramatically, not in ways anyone else would notice, but in subtle shifts that only he seemed aware of. The air felt less tense, as if it no longer needed to brace itself for arguments that never quite happened. Silence no longer felt like something waiting to explode. It simply existed. He moved through the rooms slowly that first morning alone, touching familiar objects with a strange sense of detachment. The mug she always used, the jacket she'd left draped over a chair. He didn't rush to remove anything. This wasn't about erasing her. It was about reclaiming space, physical and emotional, that had been quietly shrinking for months. At work, people noticed something different about him. He was calmer, more focused, less willing to absorb nonsense. He spoke only when necessary, listened more than he talked, and stopped apologizing for boundaries. It felt like shedding a skin he hadn't realized was weighing him down. The inquiry at her company deepened. What had started as a routine review expanded into something far more serious. Requests for interviews multiplied. Legal representatives appeared in meeting rooms. The tone of internal communications shifted from reassuring to evasive. He wasn't officially involved, and that was intentional. Every move he'd made had been calculated to keep him out of the narrative while ensuring the truth had no choice but to surface. He didn't attend meetings. He didn't speak to reporters when the first quiet questions began circulating. He stayed silent and let the evidence speak. She called him late one night, her voice strained and hoarse. "They suspended him," she said, effective immediately. He closed his eyes slowly. "And you?" he asked. "I'm on leave," she replied. "They won't say for how long." There was a pause, heavy and uncertain. "I never wanted this," she added, as if saying it aloud might make it true. "I know," he said, and he did. But knowing didn't undo the damage. After the call ended, he sat alone on the couch, staring at the darkened television screen. He expected to feel triumph, vindication, relief. Instead, what he felt was a quiet sadness for the life they had almost had and the version of her that might have existed if fear hadn't guided her choices. The woman from the cafe reached out again, this time with updates of her own. Others had begun speaking. More names were being added. Patterns were being acknowledged openly instead of dismissed as coincidence. "You did the right thing," she wrote. "Even if it doesn't feel like it yet." He read the message twice before responding. "I just didn't want the truth buried," he wrote back. Weeks passed. The story, once confined to internal channels, began to seep outward. Carefully worded articles appeared, hinting at misconduct without naming names. Comment sections filled with speculation. Former employees shared vague statements about toxic leadership and unspoken expectations. He watched it unfold from a distance, feeling both connected to it and strangely separate. This was no longer his story alone. It had grown beyond the beach, beyond the marriage, beyond the quiet nights of research and restraint. One afternoon, he received a message from her asking to meet. They chose a public place. Neutral ground. A cafe neither of them had been to before. When she walked in, he almost didn't recognize her. She looked smaller somehow, less polished, like someone who had been carrying too much weight for too long. They sat across from each other in silence at first. "I'm sorry," she said eventually. "Not just for the affair, for everything." He listened, without interrupting. "I convinced myself I didn't have a choice," she continued. "That surviving meant going along with it. I didn't see how much I was losing until it was already gone." "You always had a choice," he said gently. "It just wasn't an easy one." She nodded, tears welling. "I know that now." They talked for a long time, about fear, about ambition, about how power distorts judgment when it's wrapped in praise. She didn't ask him to forgive her. She didn't ask him to come back. In that, at least, she showed a clarity she hadn't had before. When they stood to leave, she hesitated. "I hope you find happiness," she said quietly. He met her eyes. "I'm working on it." As he walked away, he felt a sense of finality settle over him. Not closure, something deeper than that. Acceptance. The fallout accelerated soon after. The company released a statement acknowledging serious failures in leadership. Resignations followed, investigations widened. Names were eventually printed, carefully but unmistakably. The man who had once seemed untouchable was suddenly absent from every public space he dominated. The day the final report was released, he sat alone in his apartment, reading it slowly, line by line. The language was formal, restrained, but the truth cut through it all the same. Abuse of power, coercive relationships, retaliation. He closed the document and leaned back, exhaling deeply. It was over, not cleanly, not without scars, but over. In the weeks that followed, he focused on rebuilding in small, deliberate ways. Morning runs along a different stretch of beach, the same ocean, but a new beginning. Cooking meals just for himself, reconnecting with friends he'd unintentionally drifted from while trying to hold a marriage together. He started therapy, not because he felt broken, but because he wanted to understand how he'd ignored his own instincts for so long. How loyalty had turned into self-erasure. How love had become something he thought he had to earn through silence. The sessions were hard, honest, necessary. One evening, months later, he stood on his balcony, watching the city lights flicker on. His phone buzzed with a notification, a message from someone new, someone kind, someone who asked questions and listened to the answers. He didn't rush to respond. He smiled, set the phone down, and let the moment breathe. For the first time since that night on the beach, he felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Peace, not the fragile kind that depends on someone else behaving a certain way. The solid kind that comes from knowing you can face the truth, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. Somewhere behind him, the past finally loosened its grip, and ahead, waiting quietly, was a life built not on illusion, but on choice. Peace, he learned, was not a destination you arrived at and stayed in. It was something you practiced, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with discipline, often in the face of memories that refused to stay buried. The quiet he had found after everything unraveled was real, but it was also fragile, easily disturbed by a song on the radio, a familiar scent, or the sight of a couple laughing too freely in public. He kept moving anyway. Mornings became his anchor. He ran before sunrise now. When the streets were still half asleep and the world felt neutral again, the rhythm of his breath, the burn in his lungs, and the steady beat of his feet against pavement, these were things he could trust. They asked nothing of him except presence. At work, opportunities began to surface, not because he chased them, but because he stopped shrinking himself to accommodate others. When a leadership role opened unexpectedly, he didn't dismiss it as something meant for someone louder or more connected. He considered it carefully, weighed the cost, and said yes. The confidence surprised people. It surprised him too. Therapy forced him to confront questions he had avoided for years. Why he equated endurance with virtue. Why he believed being understanding meant absorbing harm quietly. Why he had confused loyalty with self-sacrifice. Some sessions left him exhausted, sitting in his car afterward with his hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at nothing until the weight of the conversation settled. But with every uncomfortable truth came clarity. He began to recognize the early warning signs he'd ignored, not just in his marriage, but in friendships, workplaces, even family dynamics. He practiced saying no without apology. He practiced asking for what he needed without dressing it up as a favor. It felt unnatural at first, like speaking a language he'd once been fluent in but hadn't used in years. The woman he'd been messaging reached out again, this time suggesting coffee. He agreed, cautiously, aware of how easily loneliness can masquerade as readiness. They met on a Saturday morning, sunlight spilling through wide windows, the cafe alive with quiet conversations and clinking cups. She was warm in a way that didn't demand anything. Curious without being invasive, when he spoke, she listened not with the intensity of someone collecting information, but with the ease of someone genuinely interested. He found himself laughing, surprised by the sound of it, surprised by how little effort it took. They talked about small things, books, travel, the strange relief of cooking meals for one. He didn't mention the beach. He didn't mention the investigation or the marriage. And she didn't push. When they parted, there was no promise made, just a sense of possibility that didn't feel rushed or heavy. That night, alone in his apartment, he thought about how different this felt from before. How calm, how grounded. He understood then that healing wasn't about replacing what he'd lost. It was about learning to meet people as he was now, not as the version of himself shaped by fear and compromise. News of the fallout continued to ripple outward. Former employees spoke more openly. Policies were revised. Training programs were announced. None of it erased what had happened, but it acknowledged it in a way that mattered. He followed these developments from afar, no longer emotionally tethered to the outcome. She reached out less frequently now. When she did, the tone was different, more honest, less desperate. One afternoon, she sent a message he hadn't expected. "I've started therapy too," it read. "Not to fix what I broke with you, just to understand myself." He stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "I hope it helps," he wrote. And he meant it. Forgiveness, he realized, was not a single decision. It was a process. One that didn't always involve reconciliation. Sometimes it simply meant releasing the need to be understood by the person who hurt you. Weeks turned into months. Seasons shifted. The sharp edges of memory dulled, replaced by something more manageable. He still thought about the beach sometimes, not with the same pain, but with a distant awareness of how quickly life can split into before and after. On a quiet evening, he found himself back near the water, standing at a distance this time, watching the tide roll in under a pale sky. Couples walked by. Children chased each other along the shoreline. The scene no longer felt hostile. It felt neutral. Open. He understood then that the injustice he'd felt, the sense of being wronged while others moved freely, had transformed into something else entirely. Not resignation, not bitterness, but acceptance of a truth he'd resisted for too long. You cannot control who betrays you. You can control what you become afterward. As he turned away from the beach, heading back toward the life he was still building, his phone buzzed with a message from the woman he'd met for coffee. A simple question. No pressure. No expectation. He smiled, slipped the phone into his pocket, and kept walking. There would be more chapters, more risks, more moments where trust would be tested again, but this time, he would meet them with open eyes and steady boundaries. The story that began with humiliation and silence had reshaped itself into something quieter, stronger, and far more honest. And for the first time, he felt ready for whatever came next, not because he believed nothing bad would happen again, but because he trusted himself to survive it, if it did. Readiness, he discovered, it didn't announce itself with confidence or certainty. It arrived quietly, disguised as restraint, as the ability to pause instead of react, as the choice to observe rather than assume. He noticed it in himself during moments that would once have sent him spiraling an unanswered text, a delayed reply, a change in tone. Where anxiety used to rush in, there was now space. That space mattered. He saw the woman from the cafe again, this time for a walk along a crowded park trail. It was casual, unplanned, the kind of meeting that didn't carry expectations heavy enough to bend under. They talked about work frustrations, about how adulthood seemed to reward exhaustion, about how strange it felt to start over without the drama people expected to accompany endings. She asked him, gently, what had ended for him. He didn't offer details. He didn't need to. He said only that he had learned the cost of ignoring himself, that he had mistaken silence for peace. She nodded, understanding more than he'd explained. What surprised him most was how little he felt compelled to impress her. There was no performance, no curated version of himself, designed to be palatable. He spoke plainly. When he didn't know how to answer something, he said so. When he needed time, he took it. It felt unfamiliar. It felt right. At work, the leadership role demanded more of him than he'd anticipated. Difficult conversations, unpopular decisions, accountability that could no longer be deferred or softened. He approached it the same way he'd learned to approach his personal life, with clarity and boundaries. He didn't absorb blame that wasn't his. He didn't protect people from consequences they'd earned. Some colleagues resisted the change. Others respected it immediately. Either way, he didn't adjust himself to accommodate discomfort. He'd done enough of that already. One afternoon, as he was reviewing a quarterly report, his phone buzzed with a number he hadn't seen in weeks. He stared at the screen longer than necessary before answering. She sounded different, quieter, less frantic. They closed it, she said. The investigation. He won't be coming back. He exhaled slowly. And you? He asked. I resigned, she replied. I didn't want to stay somewhere that reminded me of who I was when I stopped telling the truth. He didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what the appropriate reaction was anymore. I'm moving, she added. New city, new start. That sounds brave, he said finally. There was a pause. I wanted you to hear it from me, she said. Not from anyone else. I appreciate that, he replied. And he did. When the call ended, he felt something close. Not relief, not closure, but a sense of completion, like the last thread connecting him to that chapter had finally loosened. That evening, he met the woman from the cafe for dinner. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences. At one point, she reached across the table and touched his hand, not urgently, not possessively, just enough to be present. He noticed how his body responded. No tension, no impulse to pull away or cling, just awareness. Later, as they walked to their cars, she asked if he wanted to see her again. Yes, he said, without hesitation. The simplicity of the answer surprised him. Driving home, he thought about how different this felt from the beginning of his marriage. How back then, he'd rushed certainty, eager to prove something to himself. How now, he was content to let connection unfold at its own pace. Healing, he realized, wasn't about becoming invulnerable. It was about becoming honest with yourself first, and then with others. Weeks passed, their connection deepened, slowly and deliberately. They talked about fears without dramatizing them, about past mistakes without turning them into identities, about the future as something flexible, not fixed. One night, sitting on his balcony with the city spread out below, he told her about the beach, not the graphic details, but the feeling, the shock, the way the ground had seemed to disappear beneath his feet. She listened without interrupting, her expression steady. "That must have been devastating," she said softly. "It was," he replied, "but it also forced me to see what I'd been avoiding." "What was that?" "That love without self-respect isn't love," he said. "It's fear wearing loyalty's face." She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm glad you saw it," she said. So was he. The next morning, he woke to sunlight streaming through the windows, and a sense of calm that no longer felt borrowed. He brewed coffee, answered messages, prepared for the day ahead. Ordinary actions, infused now with a quiet confidence. Later that week, he received an email from a colleague thanking him for handling a difficult situation with integrity. It wasn't praise he sought, but it mattered all the same. It reminded him that who he was becoming extended beyond his personal life, that growth, once started, had a way of touching everything. He thought again of the man who had once believed endurance was the highest virtue, who had stood on a beach watching his world collapse and felt powerless. He didn't feel pity for that version of himself anymore. He felt gratitude. Without that moment, he might never have learned the cost of silence. One evening, after a long day, he and the woman sat together, watching the city lights blink on one by one. She leaned against him, comfortable, unguarded. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "That I don't feel like I'm running anymore," he said. "Or chasing." She smiled. "Good. Then you're exactly where you should be." He believed her. Life didn't become perfect. There were still hard days, moments of doubt, echoes of old wounds that flared unexpectedly. But he met them differently now, with patience, with honesty, with the understanding that his worth wasn't determined by how much he could endure in silence. The story that began with betrayal had transformed into something quieter, but far more powerful. A story about choosing yourself, and that choice, he knew now, was one he would continue making again and again, no matter what came next. The more settled his life became, the more he understood how easily stability can be mistaken for certainty. He didn't want certainty anymore. He wanted awareness. The difference mattered. Certainty had kept him quiet once. Awareness kept him honest. The woman beside him patient, thoughtful, present, never pushed for definitions. They moved forward without forcing momentum, letting the shape of their connection reveal itself naturally. Some evenings they talked late into the night, unpacking beliefs they'd inherited without question. Other nights they sat in comfortable silence, sharing space without needing to fill it. He noticed how his body responded differently now. No constant vigilance, no bracing for disappointment. Trust, he learned, wasn't blind faith. It was the ability to assess, to respond, to leave if necessary without losing yourself. That realization alone felt like freedom. At work, the aftermath of the scandal continued to ripple outward. New leadership was installed. Policies rewritten, trainings mandated. It was strange to witness an institution, attempting to repair itself through language and structure, as if those things alone could undo years of quiet damage. Still, he recognized the value in the effort. Change rarely came cleanly, but it had to start somewhere. He was asked carefully, privately, if he would be willing to consult on culture initiatives, not as a spokesperson, not as a symbol, but as someone who had observed how silence and power interact. He agreed with clear boundaries. His contribution would be practical, not performative. In those meetings, he spoke plainly about how fear distorts judgment, about how systems reward compliance while punishing discomfort, about how loyalty can be weaponized when accountability is optional. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. The truth landed anyway. One afternoon, after a particularly heavy session, he stepped outside and called the woman he'd been seeing. He didn't recount details. He just told her he needed a walk by the water. They met at a familiar stretch of shoreline, the same ocean but a different hour. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the sand. He felt a brief tightening in his chest as memory brushed against the present, but it passed quickly. He focused on her voice, the sound of waves, the steady rhythm of breath. "This place doesn't hurt the way it used to," he said. She smiled. "That's progress." They walked until the sky shifted colors, until the day softened into evening. He felt gratitude, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind that sits comfortably in the chest. Gratitude for the lessons he hadn't asked for, but had finally learned. Later that week, a letter arrived at his apartment addressed in handwriting he recognized immediately. He considered leaving it unopened, but curiosity won out. Inside, there were no excuses, no pleas, just acknowledgement. She wrote about responsibility, about how fear had driven her choices, and how she now understood that fear didn't absolve her of harm. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask for reconciliation. She wished him well, sincerely, and said she hoped he'd continue choosing honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, not as a keepsake, but as a marker. A reminder that endings could be respectful, even if they weren't mutual. That night, he slept deeply for the first time in a long while. As months passed, life continued to widen. He took a short trip alone, something he'd never done before without framing it as a compromise. He explored a new city at his own pace, lingered in bookstores, ate meals without checking his phone. He felt present in a way he hadn't realized he'd been missing. When he returned, the woman welcomed him without questions, without insecurity. They shared stories. When he was ready, the ease between them felt earned. One evening, sitting together on his couch, she asked him what he wanted next. He thought carefully before answering. "I want to keep building a life that doesn't require me to disappear," he said, "with someone who doesn't need me to." She nodded. "That sounds like a good plan." It was the first time they spoke openly about intention, and it felt grounding rather than heavy. At work, his role expanded again. Not upward this time, but outward. Mentorship, support, quiet advocacy for people who didn't yet have the language to articulate what felt wrong. He didn't rescue anyone. He offered tools, perspective, and the assurance that questioning a system wasn't a personal failure. He recognized pieces of his former self in those conversations. The hesitation, the self-doubt, the instinct to endure. He offered a different model, not one of rebellion, but of clarity. On a rainy evening, months after the beach, he found himself alone again, standing by the window, watching droplets race down the glass. He thought about how much had changed without spectacle, how healing had arrived not through grand gestures, but through consistent, honest choices. He texted the woman a simple question. "Dinner tomorrow?" Her reply came quickly. "I'd love that." He smiled, set the phone aside, and let the quiet settle. There were still moments of grief that surprised him less now. Grief, he learned, wasn't proof of failure. It was evidence of care. The difference was that it no longer controlled him. As he prepared for bed, He caught his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at him seemed familiar in a way that felt earned, not hardened, not naive, just present. The story that had begun with humiliation had transformed into something steadier, something grounded in truth rather than reaction. He didn't know how it would continue, and that uncertainty no longer frightened him. He turned off the light and lay down, breathing evenly, aware of the quiet strength that had taken root. Whatever came next, he would meet it awake. Awake no longer meant guarded. That distinction mattered. He could feel the difference in the way his shoulders rested, in how his thoughts no longer raced ahead, searching for threats that hadn't yet arrived. Awareness had replaced anticipation, and with it came a steadier sense of choice. The relationship continued to unfold at a pace that felt almost unfamiliar. There were no dramatic declarations, no urgent promises meant to anchor uncertainty. Instead, there were shared routines, slowly taking shape. Grocery shopping together on Sunday mornings, texts that didn't demand immediate replies, laughter over small, unremarkable things that somehow carried more weight than grand gestures ever had. One evening, as they cooked dinner together in his kitchen, she asked him a question that stopped him mid-chop. "What scares you now?" she asked gently. He considered it carefully, knife resting on the cutting board. "Losing myself again," he said. "Not to someone else, to my own silence." She nodded, accepting the answer without trying to soften it. "That's a fair fear," she said. "It keeps you paying attention." He realized then that fear, when acknowledged, it didn't have to be paralyzing. It could be instructive. At work, the cultural shifts he'd helped initiate were meeting resistance. Change always did. Some managers dismissed it as overcorrection. Others nodded publicly, while quietly reverting to old habits. He didn't take it personally. He understood now that transformation was rarely unanimous. It was incremental, often invisible until it wasn't. He documented patterns, asked questions in meetings that disrupted comfortable narratives. He didn't accuse. He observed. And slowly, the conversations began to change. Less defensiveness, more listening, a willingness, however tentative, to examine what had once been ignored. One afternoon, after a long day of difficult discussions, he stepped outside and called his therapist instead of bottling the frustration. The call was brief but grounding. He spoke honestly about exhaustion, about the temptation to disengage. "You're allowed to rest without abandoning your values," she reminded him. That sentence stayed with him. Rest no longer felt like retreat. It felt like maintenance. That weekend, he and the woman took a short trip out of the city. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet town with narrow streets, small cafes, and a long stretch of walking paths near the water. They spent hours wandering without a plan, talking about books they'd loved, mistakes they'd made, beliefs they were still unlearning. One evening, sitting on a bench overlooking the shoreline, she asked him about forgiveness. "Do you think you've forgiven her?" she asked. He watched the water move steadily in the distance. "I think I've stopped needing her to be someone different than she was," he said. "That feels close enough." She smiled softly. "That sounds like forgiveness to me." Maybe it was. Or maybe it was acceptance, wearing a gentler name. Back home, a message awaited him from an unfamiliar sender. It was brief, professional, and carefully worded. A journalist was working on a broader piece about systemic misconduct in corporate environments and had come across his name through multiple sources. They wanted to talk. He read the message twice before closing it. That night, he considered the implications. Visibility had a cost. He had learned that firsthand. He also knew that silence, while safer, carried its own weight. He discussed it with the woman, laying out his concerns without minimizing them. She listened, asked thoughtful questions, didn't push him toward a decision. "What do you want to come from it?" she asked. "Understanding," he replied. "Not attention." "Then let that guide you," she said. He agreed to a limited conversation, on record but without personal details. He spoke about structures, not individuals, about how power thrived in ambiguity, about how systems failed people who were afraid to speak. He didn't tell his whole story. He told enough. When the article was published weeks later, it didn't center him. It didn't sensationalize anything. It added one more thread to a growing tapestry of accountability. That felt right. His phone buzzed occasionally with messages from acquaintances who recognized pieces of his perspective. Some thanked him, others asked questions. A few criticized him for reopening old wounds. He accepted all of it without internalizing any of it. One message, however, stood out. It was from her. I read the article. It said, "I'm glad you spoke. I wish I had done the same sooner." He stared at the screen, feeling a familiar mix of sadness and compassion. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, it was simple. "I hope you keep choosing honesty," he wrote. There was no reply. As autumn settled in, he noticed how much lighter his days felt. Not because they were easier, but because they were truer. He no longer measured himself against someone else's expectations. He evaluated his choices based on alignment rather than approval. The woman became a steady presence, not a solution to loneliness, but a companion in growth. They argued occasionally, disagreed openly, resolved things without punishment or withdrawal. It was imperfect. It was real. One night, as they sat together watching rain streak down the windows, she rested her head on his shoulder and sighed contentedly. "This feels safe," she said. He thought about that word, safe. Once, it had meant predictable, controlled, free of conflict. Now, it meant honest, responsive, alive. "Yeah," he said, "it does." Later, alone in bed, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The shock of betrayal, the slow accumulation of truth, the decision to act with integrity rather than impulse, the rebuilding that followed not as an act of defiance, but as an affirmation of self-worth. He understood now that healing wasn't linear. It looped back on itself, revisited old terrain with new eyes, but each pass left him stronger, more grounded. As he drifted towards sleep, one thought settled clearly in his mind. The worst thing that had happened to him had also given him back his voice. And this time, he had no intention of losing it again. Keeping his voice didn't mean using it constantly. That was another lesson he learned slowly, through restraint rather than force. There were days when speaking up mattered, and days when silence was simply rest, not retreat. The difference lay in intention, and he had become careful with his intentions. As the year edged closer to its end, invitations began to arrive. Holiday gatherings, work events, social obligations that once would have filled him with a quiet dread. This time, he chose selectively. He attended what felt meaningful, declined what didn't. No elaborate excuses, no guilt. At one of those gatherings, a colleague pulled him aside, lowering her voice. She thanked him for something he hadn't realized had traveled so far, his refusal to dismiss discomfort as weakness. She told him she'd left a department that had been draining her for years and felt lighter for it. He listened, humbled, reminded that integrity often echoes beyond its original moment. That night, driving home, he felt a strange mix of responsibility and relief. Influence, he understood now, didn't require authority. It required consistency. The woman beside him continued to be a quiet counterbalance to the noise of everything else. They spent evenings cooking, sometimes failing spectacularly at new recipes, and laughing through the mess. On weekends, they explored neighborhoods neither of them knew well, letting curiosity guide them. He noticed how his body relaxed around her, how his mind didn't race ahead, looking for exits. One evening, as they sat on the floor sorting through old books he planned to donate, she picked one up and smiled. "I loved this one," she said. "I haven't thought about it in years." He watched her flip through the pages, the intimacy of shared memory settling gently between them. It struck him how different this closeness felt, unforced, unguarded, not built on promises, but on presence. Later that night, she asked him something he hadn't expected. Do you ever wonder who you would have been if none of that had happened? She asked quietly. He considered the question carefully. Sometimes, he said, but I don't miss that version of myself. She looked at him, curious. He was loyal, he continued, but he was afraid of loss, afraid of conflict, afraid that setting boundaries meant being unlovable. And now, she asked, now I know that being unlovable to the wrong person is the price of being honest with the right ones. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Winter arrived without ceremony, shorter days, colder air. The city slowed, wrapped in layers and early darkness. He found comfort in routine morning coffee, evening walks, the predictable rhythm of work that no longer felt like an escape. The investigation's final ripples faded into the background. Legal proceedings continued quietly, far from his daily life. He didn't follow them closely anymore. He didn't need the outcome to validate his experience. One afternoon, while clearing out old emails, he stumbled across messages from the early days of his marriage. Plans, jokes, assumptions about the future that now felt naive rather than tragic. He read a few, then archived the rest. Without ceremony, he wasn't erasing history. He was contextualizing it. That evening, he told the woman about the emails, not with bitterness, but with a sense of distance that surprised him. I don't feel angry when I read them, he said. I just feel done. That's not indifference, she replied. That's integration. The word lingered with him. Integration meant the past no longer needed to be denied or relived. It simply existed, informing the present without controlling it. As the holidays approached, he received a message from a family member asking if he'd be attending the annual gathering. For years, those gatherings had been exercises in endurance, unspoken tensions, polite avoidance, old expectations. He hesitated, then agreed, but on his own terms. The gathering was smaller this year, quieter. Conversations felt less performative. When uncomfortable topics arose, he didn't deflect or appease. He spoke honestly, calmly. To his surprise, the world didn't collapse. Some people leaned in. Others leaned away. Both responses felt acceptable. On the drive home, he felt a deep sense of alignment. This was what it meant to live congruently, allowing your actions to reflect your values, even when it created friction. Later that night, curled up on the couch with the woman, he felt gratitude again, not sharp or overwhelming, but steady. Gratitude for growth, for discomfort survived, for clarity earned. She rested her head on his shoulder, half asleep. You seem lighter, she murmured. I am, he said. Not because things are perfect, because I'm not carrying what isn't mine anymore. As the year drew to a close, he reflected on how the story had shifted. What began as a moment of humiliation had become a long, deliberate process of self-reclamation. The beach was no longer a symbol of loss. It was simply where awareness had begun. He didn't romanticize the pain. He didn't minimize it either. It had changed him. It had cost him. But it had also returned something essential, his agency. On the final night of the year, they stood together watching fireworks scatter light across the sky. He felt her hand in his, warm and steady. No fear, no need to predict the future, just presence. As the last sparks faded, he made a quiet promise to himself. Not about love, or success, or certainty, but about honesty. Whatever came next, he would meet it as he was awake, grounded and unwilling to disappear. And that, he knew, was more than enough. The new year didn't arrive with declarations or dramatic resolutions. It came quietly, like most meaningful changes did, slipping into his life through routine rather than promise. He woke on the first morning with sunlight cutting across the bedroom floor and a sense of steadiness that no longer surprised him. He brewed coffee while the city stretched awake outside his windows. The day ahead held no special markers, no milestones, and yet he felt something settle into place, a subtle understanding, that this was no longer recovery, it was continuation. The woman moved through his life with the same unforced ease. They didn't mark anniversaries of pain or rebirth. They built something new by paying attention to the present. She stayed over some nights, left early others. They respected each other's rhythms without explanation. It felt adult in a way his marriage never quite had. One afternoon, while they sat together, reading in companionable silence, she broke the quiet. "Have you thought about what you want long term?" she asked. The question didn't tighten his chest the way it once would have. He closed his book, considering. "I want honesty that doesn't feel like a risk," he said. "I want partnership without surveillance, and I want space to keep growing without someone needing me to stay the same." She nodded slowly. "That sounds sustainable." He smiled. That was exactly the word. At work, his leadership role brought a different kind of challenge. Not crisis management, not damage control, but vision. He was asked to help shape a new initiative focused on accountability and transparency. The irony wasn't lost on him. A year ago, he would have declined, afraid of visibility. Now, he accepted with clarity, setting firm boundaries about scope and intent. In meetings, he noticed how people responded differently to him. Not because he was louder, but because he was consistent. He didn't over-explain. He didn't seek approval. He spoke when it mattered and listened when it didn't. One evening, after a particularly long day, he received a message from an unfamiliar number. It took him a moment to recognize the name. It was from someone who had worked under the same executive years ago, someone who had stayed silent, someone who hadn't. The message was brief. "I didn't know how to say thank you then. I do now." He stared at the screen, a lump forming in his throat. He hadn't expected gratitude. He hadn't acted for recognition. And yet, the acknowledgement mattered. He typed back slowly. "I hope you're doing okay." The reply came almost immediately. "I am." Finally, that night, lying beside the woman, he told her about the message, not with pride, with humility. "It feels strange," he admitted. "Knowing something that hurt me also helped someone else." She turned toward him, her expression thoughtful. "Pain doesn't have to be wasted," she said. "Not if you learn from it." Weeks passed. The season shifted almost imperceptibly. Winter loosened its grip, giving way to early hints of spring. He found himself looking forward more than backward now, planning trips, saying yes to things that once would have felt like burdens. One weekend, he visited his parents. The dynamic had always been complicated, unspoken expectations, emotional restraint passed down like an heirloom. This time, he arrived without armor. At dinner, when familiar patterns emerged, he didn't deflect. He spoke calmly about his choices, about his divorce, about the kind of life he was building now. The conversation wasn't easy. It wasn't smooth, but it was real. On the drive home, he felt tired but not depleted. Honest fatigue, earned through presence rather than performance. Later that evening, the woman asked how it went. "I didn't pretend," he said. "That's new." She smiled. "That's growth." The past, when it surfaced now, did so differently. Less like a wound, more like a scar, visible, instructive, no longer bleeding. He could talk about the betrayal without reliving it. He could remember love without romanticizing what it had cost him. One afternoon, while sorting through old storage boxes, he came across the beach photo he'd taken months ago, the one that had once made his hands shake. He studied it now, not with anger, but with distance. He deleted it without ceremony. That chapter no longer needed proof. The woman noticed the shift too. One night, as they sat on the balcony watching the city glow beneath them, she leaned into him. "You seem settled," she said, "not complacent, just aligned." He thought about the word. "Yes," he said. "That's it." They didn't rush declarations. They didn't need to. Trust was built not through urgency, but through repetition, showing up, telling the truth, respecting limits. There were disagreements, moments of miscommunication, but they navigated them without threat or withdrawal. Repair replaced punishment. Listening replaced defense. One evening, after resolving a small but meaningful conflict, she laughed softly. "This is what people mean when they say relationships take work, isn't it?" she said. "Not suffering, just effort." He smiled. "I wish I'd known the difference sooner." She squeezed his hand. "You know it now." As spring arrived in full, he returned to the beach, not to reclaim it, not to rewrite history, but simply because he wanted to be there. The sand felt the same beneath his feet. The ocean moved with the same indifferent grace. But he was different. He stood there, breathing in the salt air, feeling no urge to revisit the past, no need to frame the moment. It wasn't symbolic anymore. It was just a place. And that, somehow, felt like victory. Later that night, back home, he wrote in a journal he'd kept since everything fell apart. He no longer filled its pages with questions or rage. He wrote about what he was building, about values, about the quiet courage of choosing honesty over comfort. He closed the journal and set it aside. Content. The story that had begun with betrayal had not ended in bitterness or spectacle. It had unfolded into something quieter, stronger, more enduring. Not redemption, integration. And as he turned off the light and lay down beside the woman who met him without illusion, he understood something with absolute clarity. He was no longer defined by what had been done to him. He was defined by what he chose next. Choice became less about grand moments and more about consistency. He felt it in the way he answered emails, in how he scheduled his days with space instead of urgency, in the quiet confidence with which he said no when something didn't align. The muscle of self-trust strengthened with use, and with it came a steadier rhythm to his life. The woman noticed before he did. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, she paused, watching him rinse vegetables at the sink. "You don't second-guess yourself the way you used to," she said. He smiled faintly. "I still question things. I just don't question my right to ask." She nodded, satisfied. It was a subtle distinction, but it mattered. Questioning was curiosity now, not self-erasure. Work continued to demand attention, but it no longer defined him. He delegated with intention, trusted others to carry responsibility, and accepted that mistakes were part of any honest system. When conflicts arose, he addressed them directly. Without rehearsing outcomes or bracing for rejection, he found that most people responded better to clarity than to careful avoidance. One afternoon, after a long strategy session, he stepped outside to clear his head. The air was warm, the city buzzing with life. He checked his phone and saw a missed call from a number he hadn't seen in months. His stomach tightened briefly before he recognized the familiar pattern and let it pass. He returned the call later that evening, choosing timing instead of impulse. She answered quietly. There was no panic in her voice now. No urgency. Just a measured tone that felt practiced in a different way. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. "I got a new job. Different industry. Smaller company." "That's good," he replied. And it was. He meant it without reservation. "I've been honest with them," she continued, "about what I'm willing to accept, about boundaries." He paused, absorbing the weight of that statement. Growth didn't erase harm, but it did matter. "I'm glad," he said. "For you." They didn't linger. There was no nostalgia to indulge, no reopening of wounds. When the call ended, he felt neither relief nor regret, just a quiet acknowledgement that people could change without being reinserted into your life. Later that night, he told the woman about the call. She listened, her expression open. "How did it feel?" she asked. "Neutral," he said after a moment. "In a good way. That's clarity," she replied. "Not everything needs an emotional charge." The idea settled comfortably in him. As the weeks passed, the relationship deepened in ways that felt earned rather than accelerated. They spent time with each other's friends, navigated differences without keeping score, learned each other's rhythms without trying to control them. He noticed how disagreements no longer felt like threats to stability. They were simply information. One evening, after a minor misunderstanding that ended in laughter rather than silence, he felt a surge of gratitude, not for the absence of conflict, but for the presence of repair. This was the partnership he hadn't known to ask for. At work, a significant meeting loomed, one that would determine the direction of a long-term initiative he'd helped design. The stakes were high, the room filled with people accustomed to dominating conversation. He entered without rehearsing his lines, grounded in preparation rather than performance. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't hedge. He spoke plainly about values, about the cost of ignoring early warning signs, about how systems failed when accountability was optional. He didn't frame his points as moral imperatives. He framed them as practical realities. The room was quiet when he finished. The initiative passed. Later, alone in his office, he sat back and let the moment register, not as a victory over anyone else, but as a confirmation that his voice used with intention could create movement without force. That evening, he and the woman celebrated with takeout and a movie. Sprawled comfortably on the couch, halfway through, she turned to him. "You look proud," she said. "I am," he replied. "Not of the outcome, of how I showed up." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "That's the kind of pride that lasts." As spring gave way to early summer, the city seemed to expand with possibility. They planned a longer trip together, careful not to treat it as a test or milestone, just time, just shared experience. Before they left, he returned to the beach one more time alone, this time, not out of compulsion, but curiosity. He walked along the shoreline, feeling the sand shift beneath his feet, listening to the familiar rhythm of waves. He realized something then that surprised him. The memory no longer owned the place. He could recall the shock, the injustice, the moment his world tilted, but it felt like recalling a storm after the sky had cleared. Significant, yes. Defining, no. He sat for a while, watching the horizon, then stood and brushed the sand from his hands. There was nothing to reclaim here, nothing to confront, just forward motion. On the trip, they moved easily together, navigating missed turns, unexpected delays, shared wonder. They argued once, briefly, about nothing important. They resolved it quickly, without needing to assign blame. He noticed how his body remained relaxed, how trust didn't require vigilance. One evening, sitting on a balcony overlooking unfamiliar streets, she asked him a question he hadn't anticipated. "Do you think you'd recognize it now?" she asked. "Recognize what?" he replied. "The early signs," she said gently. If something started to feel wrong, he considered it carefully. "Yes," he said. "Not because I'm smarter, because I'm listening." She nodded, satisfied. When they returned home, life resumed its familiar rhythm. Work, friends, quiet nights. He didn't feel the need to narrate progress anymore. Growth had become internal, less performative. One afternoon, he received a message from someone new at work, asking for advice. He agreed to meet, aware of the responsibility, but also the opportunity. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions instead of offering conclusions. As the conversation ended, the person thanked him for creating space. "You didn't tell me what to do," they said. "You helped me hear myself." He smiled. That felt right. That night, lying in bed, he reflected on how far he'd come, not measured in distance from pain, but in proximity to truth. He no longer needed dramatic endings or perfect beginnings. He needed alignment. As sleep pulled him under, one final thought surfaced, clear and steady. The betrayal had taught him what silence costs. Healing had taught him what honesty builds. And the life he was living now, deliberate, grounded, awake, was proof that choosing yourself doesn't harden you. It frees you. Freedom, he learned, didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in moments that tested it, in situations that looked ordinary on the surface but carried the weight of old patterns underneath. The real proof of change was not comfort, it was choice under pressure, That pressure came quietly one afternoon when he least expected it. He was leaving work when his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He almost let it go to voicemail. Old instincts stirred, the reflex to avoid unexpected emotional labor. But awareness meant deciding, not defaulting. He answered. The voice on the other end was measured, professional, carefully neutral. It belonged to a legal representative, handling the final phase of the corporate fallout. They had questions, clarifications. They wanted to understand timelines, context, impact, nothing accusatory, nothing dramatic. Still, his pulse quickened. He asked for details, took notes, and agreed to a scheduled call later that week. When the line disconnected, he stood in the parking garage longer than necessary, letting the echoes settle. This was it, he realized. Not the explosive climax people imagine when they talk about justice. This was accountability in its real form, slow, procedural, emotionally inconvenient. That night, he told the woman about the call. He didn't dramatize it, he didn't minimize it either. How do you feel about it? She asked. Nervous, he admitted, but not afraid. She nodded. That's different. It is, he agreed. Fear used to make my decisions for me. Now it just informs them. The call came 2 days later. He spoke calmly, answered what he could, declined what felt inappropriate, and asked for boundaries when questions drifted toward speculation. He didn't embellish, he didn't protect anyone, he told the truth as he knew it, cleanly and without narrative flourish. When it ended, he felt drained but intact. He went for a long walk afterward, letting the movement ground him. He noticed how his body responded to stress now. No dissociation, no urge to disappear, just fatigue, honest and manageable. That night, he slept deeply. In the weeks that followed, the process continued quietly in the background. Occasional emails, clarifications. Then, eventually, closure. He wasn't informed of outcomes in detail, nor did he seek them. That chapter had moved fully out of his hands. What surprised him most was not relief, but trust in himself. He had faced something that once would have unraveled him, and he had remained present. The relationship felt the shift too. Not as strain, but as deepening. She saw him navigate stress without withdrawal, without deflection. He saw her offer support without taking control, without making his experience about her. One evening, sitting across from each other at a small restaurant, she reached for his hand. I feel like I'm watching you live in real time, she said. Not reacting, just choosing. He smiled softly. That's new for me. I like it, she replied. He did too. Summer settled in fully, warm and expansive. Their trip together became a shared reference point, a shorthand for ease and trust. They talked more openly now about the future, not in terms of guarantees, but in values. What they wanted to protect, what they were unwilling to sacrifice again. One night, lying side by side, she asked him something that lingered in the air between them. Do you still love her? She asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. The question deserved care. I don't love who she was at the end, he said finally. But I acknowledge that I loved who I thought she was. And I don't punish myself for that anymore. She nodded, thoughtful. That makes sense. It doesn't threaten what I feel now, he added. Because what I feel now is based on reality. She reached for him, resting her head against his chest. He felt the truth of his words settle fully. Reality, once something he'd avoided for fear of loss, had become his anchor. As the months passed, he noticed how often people around him asked for advice. Not about betrayal or scandal, but about boundaries, about uncertainty, about how to trust themselves again after disappointment. He never positioned himself as an expert. He shared what he'd learned plainly, that ignoring discomfort doesn't make it disappear, it makes it grow teeth. That love, without honesty, turns corrosive. That leaving or staying means nothing if you abandon yourself in the process. Those conversations felt meaningful, not because they affirmed his growth, but because they reminded him how common the struggle was. One afternoon, while cleaning his apartment, he came across the journal he'd kept through the worst of it. He hadn't opened it in months. On impulse, he flipped through the pages. Anger, confusion, self-blame, fear. He read without judgment, recognizing the man who had written those words. He didn't cringe. He didn't feel embarrassed. He felt compassion. He closed the journal and placed it back on the shelf, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of resilience. That evening, as he and the woman cooked together, music playing softly in the background, she watched him with a smile. "What?" he asked, amused. "You seem settled," she said. "Not because life is easy, because you're not fighting yourself anymore." He considered that. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly it." Later, as they sat on the balcony watching the city breathe, he thought about how the story would sound if someone else told it. The betrayal, the injustice, the downfall of powerful people, the redemption arc, but living it had taught him something different. The most important moments weren't dramatic. They were quiet decisions made repeatedly. To tell the truth, to stay present, to leave when necessary, to listen when something felt off, to choose dignity over denial. He didn't need the story to end with triumph. It had already given him something better: agency. As night settled in and the city lights flickered below, he felt no urge to look back. The past existed, integrated, no longer demanding attention. The future remained open, undefined, and that felt like possibility rather than threat. He reached for her hand, and she squeezed back, steady and real. Whatever came next would not be built on illusion. It would be built on choice. And this time, he would not look away. Choice, he learned, demanded maintenance. It wasn't a declaration etched into stone. It was a discipline practiced in small, often invisible moments. And sometimes, maintaining it meant walking back into spaces that once felt unsafe on your own terms. The invitation arrived, folded into an ordinary week, a formal notice for a company-wide forum announcing the new direction of leadership and culture. Attendance was optional, the message said. Encouraged, but not required. He read it twice, then set it aside. The old version of him would have declined quietly, convincing himself that absence equaled peace. The man he was now understood the difference between avoidance and boundaries. This wasn't about reliving the past. It was about witnessing the present. He decided to go. The day of the forum, he arrived early, choosing a seat near the aisle rather than the back. The room filled gradually with familiar faces, some cautious, some curious, some openly guarded. He felt a flicker of tension, acknowledged it, and let it pass. His breath steadied, his posture remained open. The new executive team spoke first, their language measured, careful not to overpromise. They acknowledged failures without dramatizing them, outlined reforms without pretending they were cures. He listened closely, not searching for redemption, just for alignment. Then, the floor opened for questions. There was a brief hesitation, the kind that follows any invitation to speak truth in public. He felt the moment stretch. He didn't rush it. When he stood, the room quieted. He didn't introduce himself with credentials or personal history. He asked a question that cut through performance and landed squarely in accountability, about how safeguards would be enforced when it became inconvenient, about how dissent would be protected when it challenged profitability, about how leadership would respond when the discomfort they claimed to value actually arrived. The room stayed quiet longer this time. The response wasn't perfect. It wasn't rehearsed either. It acknowledged limits. It named uncertainty. It committed to transparency with mechanisms, not platitudes. He sat back down, pulse steady. That was enough. After the forum, a few people approached him quietly. Some thanked him, some asked follow-up questions. One apologized for not speaking sooner. He accepted each interaction without letting it define him. This wasn't about recognition. It was about participation without self-erasure. That evening, he met the woman for dinner. She listened as he described the forum, his tone calm, almost reflective. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Complete," he said after a moment, "like I closed a loop without reopening a wound." She smiled. "That's rare." "So is doing things on your own terms," he replied. They walked afterward, the air warm and forgiving. He felt a quiet pride, not the loud kind that demanded validation, but the grounded kind that settled into the chest and stayed. In the days that followed, the forum rippled outward. Internal conversations shifted. Policies were clarified. Lines that had once been blurred were drawn with intention. He didn't monitor the outcomes obsessively. He had learned that change did not require constant surveillance to be real. A different test arrived soon after, more personal and less public. She asked him to meet her parents. The request was simple, the timing unforced. Still, it stirred something old, an echo of performances past, of trying to be palatable, of shrinking to fit expectations. He noticed the sensation and didn't let it decide for him. "I'd like that," he said. "As myself." They met on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The conversation was polite, curious, unremarkable in all the ways that mattered. He spoke honestly about his work, his values, his life. He didn't overshare. He didn't hide. When questions edged toward his past, he answered without defensiveness. Later, as they drove home, she glanced at him. "You were very present," she said. "I didn't feel like I had to audition," he replied. "That helps." She reached for his hand, squeezing it lightly. "That's exactly why I wanted you to meet them." Weeks later, he encountered her unexpectedly in a grocery store aisle. It had been long enough that the surprise didn't jolt him, but close enough to register. They stood there briefly, surrounded by ordinary noise and fluorescent light. She looked healthier, quieter, like someone learning to live without the constant pressure of pretense. They exchanged a few words, neutral, respectful. She wished him well. He returned the sentiment. There was no unresolved tension humming beneath the surface, no need to extract meaning. As he walked away, he felt nothing unravel, and that too felt like progress. Summer edged toward its end. The city shifted pace. He found himself planning again, not as an escape, but as an extension of a life he enjoyed inhabiting. He and the woman talked about the coming months with openness and flexibility. No timelines, no ultimatums. One evening, as they sat together listening to the hum of the city, she asked him a question that surprised him. "What do you think justice looks like now?" she asked. He considered it carefully. "I used to think it meant consequences," he said. "Exposure, balance restored. And now I think it means systems changing, so fewer people have to survive what I did," he replied. "And individuals learning to tell the truth sooner, even when it costs them." She nodded, thoughtful. "That's quieter. It lasts longer," he said. He returned to his journal that night and wrote without urgency, not to process pain, but to articulate intention. He wrote about boundaries that honored connection, about ambition that didn't require silence, about love that felt spacious rather than consuming. He closed the journal and felt done with it, not because he had nothing left to say, but because his life had become the place where those words lived. As autumn approached, the final professional chapter closed quietly. A formal notice confirmed the conclusion of all proceedings related to the scandal. No fanfare, no commentary, just an ending. He read the notice once and archived it. That night, lying beside the woman, he felt a sense of satisfaction that didn't need narration. He had not been vindicated in the way movies promised. He had been validated by alignment, by living in a way that no longer contradicted itself. He understood now that the climax of this story wasn't exposure or downfall. It was choice upheld under pressure. As sleep came, he felt steady, awake without being on guard, open without being unprotected. The life he was building didn't need to prove anything. It only needed to be lived, and he was ready for what remained. Sometimes, the deepest betrayal is not just being lied to, but slowly learning to lie to yourself in order to keep the peace. This story reminds us that silence can feel safe, but over time, it erodes dignity, self-trust, and joy. Real strength is not found in confrontation fueled by anger, nor in endurance disguised as loyalty. It is found in the quiet courage to face the truth, to pause, to observe, and to choose yourself without becoming bitter. Healing does not mean forgetting what hurt you. It means integrating the pain into wisdom, allowing it to sharpen your boundaries instead of hardening your heart. When you stop chasing explanations from people who refuse accountability, you reclaim your power, and when you choose honesty, especially when it costs you comfort, you begin to build a life that no longer requires you to disappear. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. What lesson stood out the most to you? Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join our community for more powerful stories about betrayal, healing, and self-respect.